Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're getting ready for our last big panel before the final What's Your Play session. And just want to quickly introduce myself. My name is Chris Watts. I'm the Executive Director of the National Foundation on Fitness, Sports, and Nutrition, which is the congressionally chartered foundation that supports the President's Council on Fitness, Sports, and Nutrition. And to introduce this discussion and really build on the remarks and leadership of the First Lady and the rest of the panelists and sessions today, I wanted to provide a few comments on how the President's Council and the Foundation are going to continue ensuring that the topics discussed today remain a national priority, as the First Lady mentioned. And so 60 years ago this year, President Eisenhower started the President's Council because there was a dire need in this country, that American youth weren't as fit as their European counterparts, particularly for military preparedness, as the General mentioned earlier today. And as we reflect on those 60 years and understand that the mission today is even more important now than ever, we are really proud to announce a new vision for the future. And yesterday, the President's Council and the Foundation announced a campaign rallied around the idea that fitness is a journey. That fitness is a journey that's different for everyone, no matter what your background, ability, or path is. And that campaign is, we want to take the country on a journey from 0 to 60. And it's a national effort to scale and accelerate this vision that we all collectively have, and to work with partnerships across the spectrum, and so we can rally support and continue this progress and make sure that we're building upon the incredible support and leadership that this administration has, but really all these groups have rallied together into the future. We know that we need national grassroots best practices, really the innovators at the table to tackle this issue, and that's really what this panel here is about, is bringing the best practices, the leaders across the country to ensure that we continue this work. And with that said, I'd like to introduce Tom Farrey, who will lead this panel and bring on the guests. Thank you. Thanks, buddy.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, buddy.
Appreciate it, Chris. And, you know, boy, we're getting close to the end here, but we got a lot more exciting content for you. And this is a really important panel. You know, we've talked about, you know, the 8 strategies so far, and we have heard from the First Lady, and she was very clear and direct that we need to collectively address this problem, that there's a role for, you know, the private sector, for everyone in this space to take clear and affirmative action. Very much a call to action on her part. So what this panel is, it's call for leadership, treetops to grassroots, how to scale a culture of health and sports. And in many ways, it's really about the how. How do we actually get there? How do we you know, deliver systems level change, as opposed to, you know, a nice story here and there, or a styrofoam check here or there? How do we actually change the system so those numbers that I threw out in the State of Play conversation this morning, 26.6% of kids ages 6 to 12 are, you know, active to a healthy level. How do we measurably lift that? How can we engage the key institutions to take meaningful next best steps? And so we have a terrific panel to help you think through this. So guys, why don't you come up? We've got Mary Davis, who is CEO of Special Olympics International.
Here.
Here. We have Benita Fitzgerald Mosley, CEO of Laureus Sport for Good Foundation, USA. And a 1984 Olympic gold medalist with us in the year of the Olympics. We have Dr. Risa Lavizzo-Mourey, who is President and CEO of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Risa. We have Jorge Perez, who is the Senior Vice President of Programs and the Y Experience for the YMCA of the USA. And we have Mr. Jim Whitehead, CEO of the American College of Sports Medicine, who may or may not get a chair. We may make you stand.
I haven't even said anything yet, and they're taking away.
Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for being part of this conversation. Well, you know, given the title of the panel, "How to Scale a Culture of Health in Sports," I think we ought to put the first question to Dr. Lavizzo-Mourey. And you've done a lot of thinking about this. This is core to what the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is all about. But so, if you can, explain to people what is a culture of health, and what is the role that sport plays in delivering on that vision?
Okay. Well, usually when they talk about a culture of health, people get, what does that actually mean? So I start with health. First of all, think about health as not just being the absence of illness, but it is a state where you have complete mental, physical, and spiritual well-being. So it's a much broader definition than just the absence of health. And I would add not only the health of the individual, but the health of the community. And then, well, what about culture? Culture, it's art, it's how we think about literature, but the sociological definition of culture can be boiled down to the way we do things around here. How we do things in our family, how we do things in our school, how we do things in our workplace. Just how we do things. So what we're trying to create, I think, and what the First Lady spoke to so eloquently, is a culture in this country and in the world where health, people actually being healthier, is the easy choice. It happens easily where we live, learn, work, and play. And so what role does sport play in that? Well, we've heard all day how sport is critical to our sense of well-being mentally and physically. It's something that can be used to galvanize people in school, at work, in their community. And so sport can be an incredibly important vehicle for helping us get to a culture of health as a nation.
Interesting. And so equity is an important concept we should talk through here a little bit. How important is equity as a guiding consideration in making sports affordable and accessible to all kids, regardless of zip code or ability? And I want to go to you, Jorge, about this. You've worked in low-income urban communities. You understand these issues in a very deep way, and you also understand them from the perspective of an administrator who works with 2,700 YMCAs and 10,000 communities across the U.S. So talk to us about equity and as a guiding consideration.
About half of our YMCAs are either in low-income or serve low-income communities. And so this question of equity is not simply about access, and we heard that all throughout the day, giving kids an opportunity and particularly around fundraising and funding. But I'll give you just one example. I remember working with a particular YMCA, and they said, "Jorge, if you help us provide resources for them, these kids, then we'll be able to serve them through sports." And so we gave them a grant of $10,000, and after the season was over, or about halfway through the season, I asked how things were going, and they said, "Well, we're going to send you the check back." And what had happened is that simply offering access is not enough for some of these kids. And so equity is about making sure that we're addressing some other more basic challenges, like the ones that were mentioned earlier, the social, emotional, the cognitive, and the physical development of kids. And if children are given access but are not, they're not ready to receive it, either because they have not established the relationships that they need to establish or the trust that the parents need to have, then access is just not going to be enough. So equity is about making sure that you are lining up the needs of the child and then the opportunity that you're creating for him or her so that they can receive it.
Yep. And Benita, how does that intersect with your work? And I know you're new with the Laureus Sport for Good Foundation, and Jamie Schmill, who is with us here today, is the project manager down there. But how do you see that intersecting the idea of equity with your work in New Orleans, which you're dealing with, very low-income populations of high need?
And I believe Jamie spoke about this a little bit earlier, but I think our theory of change for our Model City program in New Orleans is that if you combine the sports-based youth development programs with building a coalition of kind of organizations, the community-based organizations, as well as the city, et cetera, then you're going to have deeper, faster, better, more sustainable results. And you're able to scale those organizations to be able to, broaden their reach, to build their capacity so they can serve more kids, and ultimately, allow better accessibility to those programs and see the kinds of change that we're looking for, both around employability, making sure that those kids have the skills that they need to have sustained employability, to get better education, to obviously be healthier. But also there's a sense of community cohesion and community and social cohesion that comes out of that. So, all those are the outcomes we're looking for, but I think the way to do that, or at least our way to do that, and I think for funders around the country, is to be able to build those coalitions and then use sport as that tool for social change in the areas that we're trying to find.
Yeah. Now, Jim, one of the compelling developments in recent months was the release of the new National Physical Activity Plan, which has, for the first time, recommendations for the sports sector, and language in there about access and inclusion. So, can you tell us, what is the National Physical Activity Plan, and how you see access and inclusion baked into it?
Great, excellent, thank you. The National Physical Activity Plan is really this framework for private-public partnerships and collaboration, and we did a very systematic approach in developing the original one in regard to looking at what have other countries done in developing such plans for public health, for disease prevention, for addressing things, just looked at it, and we then incorporated a lot of those elements into the original National Physical Activity Plan. The second version, the new National Physical Activity Plan, was launched and released just a few weeks ago, and at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., and then we did a congressional briefing associated with it. Here are some differences. Sports wasn't in the first National Physical Activity Plan, and it's kind of like, well, wait a minute. Countries all over the world use sports as a means to keep adults and kids active, but there just was a hesitancy about it at that point. It was not only incorporated this time, it's a full-blown sector, which just means there's a whole chapter addressing sports in the new National Physical Activity Plan, appropriately so. I had the pleasure of chairing the writing group. That writing group included Tom, who did a great job, plus representatives from the Y and all kinds of other organizations.
President's Council. Yep.
President's Council, absolutely. The thing that we really focused on there is, I think in a remarkable way, is using sports not just as a platform for increasing physical activity and health, but potentially for, as we've heard already, academic achievement, cognitive function, but going beyond that, economic success, community development, a multifaceted platform in regard to sports and physical activity that could have remarkable, if you're talking about game-changing for this country and our future, game-changing ability. And so, naturally so, inclusion, reduction of barriers for all people to participate in this reimagined sports platform was not only a good thing to do, it was a vital thing to do. So we've looked at, let's look at the populations that really may be restricted from sports now. Let's identify ways to reduce those barriers. Let's look at things that make sports affordable. Let's look at things that, have a real focus on free play and on organized play that are going to be very accessible. So this wasn't just an idea added to it. It was fundamentally important of really looking at sports and physical activity as a driver of positive change and forward progress in this country.
Why do you think there was that hesitance until now? I mean, what is it about our culture that is not fully embraced sport as a tool of public health?
Yeah, it was a number of things. I don't think that there were as many at that time. I know there weren't at that time as many intentional programs that underscore physical activity and health benefits in sport. And so it was kind of like, well, where are we exactly? It preceded all kinds of programs that are there now. So I think that was one part of it, and I just think as we've developed over time, and it's only been a few years since that first version to now, there's been significant progress on that, because I can assure you this was not a may we, perhaps we're going to do it. It was absolutely that we were going to do it. And we see the manifestation of this, the connection of sports to health, not only in the National Physical Activity Plan, but in many initiatives, some of which have been announced and some that will be announced in the months ahead.
So let me just jump in, because I think one reason that we've limited ourselves is that we focus too narrowly on how we measure success. One of the things that we've seen is that, for example, with the U.S. Soccer Foundation having tournaments in low-income communities, when you have a tournament, you get the community to come out. They're rooting for the kids, and you know what? They get to know each other. They build the social capital that then allows them to think about other changes that they want in their community. Well, if all you're measuring is how much physical activity the kids on the field get, you miss all of that other benefit to the community that ultimately helps with culture of health, with many other aspects of our society. So I think we have to broaden the lens and the measures we use for success.
Yeah, the idea being is that people like sport, they're drawn to it, and therefore once you have them in there, you can do something
You can
with
do
them.
lots of things. Yeah.
And I think that's the whole intention around sports-based youth development, is that, using that tool to draw those kids in and teach them something along the way. I also think, and I was saying this last night at dinner, was that I feel like there was probably a hesitancy to some degree because people still think of sport, and in some cases physical activity as a nice to have and not a have to have. And I think, changing that shift, making it more of a culture of physical activity and sport where people feel like it's integrated into their lives and that it's not something that it's apart from their lives. It's something that they need to include, and that it's a positive, it can have positive effects beyond just the physical onto the things that you were talking about, Jorge. And I think, making that shift in the way we talk about things and really making those connections for people, school systems around the country, I think, need to rethink taking PE and physical education out of schools and recess, because we all know now it has positive outcomes with regard to cognitive educational outcomes as well. And so making that shift, I think that's probably what's starting to happen now, because those connectors are happening to say, oh, this is a great youth development tool, this is a great education tool, and people are probably more receptive. And the last thing I'll say, this is an Olympic gold medalist saying this, but I think probably some of the barriers are around people thinking of it, as you said, too narrowly, as a competitive thing, sports. And there are a lot of people who had a bad experience in elementary school, middle school, high school, being cut from teams, not being included, not feeling like they're good enough. And quite frankly, not having the opportunity after 8 or 9 or 10 years old, after people have specialized in a sport,
Right.
not being able to even enter after a certain point. And so they think sports is a barrier, not as something that's inclusive.
Or as the First Lady was saying, not being able to afford it.
Yeah, that's another option.
I mean, we have very intentionally within Project Play just defined sport broadly as organized plus unstructured play, competition with either someone else or just with yourself. If it's a matter of trying to run around the block a little bit faster, it's a very inclusive thing. We've also defined, in the glossary, an athlete as borrowing from a certain company that introduced this idea about 15 years ago, Nike, that it's anyone with a body, and it's almost like we need to sort of reset the idea of, who is an athlete, what is sport, and therefore are you part of it or not? Because kids are now, when they're 9 or 10 years old, making a decision about whether they're an athlete or they're not. And if they make that decision, then do they see themselves as someone who's going to move their body through life? So, Mary, let me ask you this. I mean, you came all the way from Dublin. Thank you, by the way. Maybe you can bring a little bit of overseas perspective to this, because Jim talked about how other countries have more intentionally baked sports into the idea of how to build public health. What have you seen elsewhere?
Well, Before I answer that, I'll just talk a little bit about Special Olympics, because actually that's what it does in a sense. It opens the hearts and minds of people and of our athletes through sport. And I think it was President Kennedy that said, all of us do not have equal talent, but we should have equal opportunity to develop our talent. And then, of course, it was his sister, Eunice Kennedy, who saw that vision for Special Olympics and created that movement nearly 50 years ago. And it is truly an organization that provides for everybody from the grassroots, and also invites in young people to play and to join, and communities to join. Yeah. And in joining, they learn so much about life, about ability, about overcoming barriers, and about acceptance. And that's one of the great sort of impacts of the Special Olympics program and of the sports program that we offer. So I just wanted to say that initially. But yes, of course, I have experience, particularly in Europe, and in many European countries, Northern Europe in particular, and my own country, Ireland, of course, we have a ministry for sport. So, and then you would have a sports council. So there's the Irish Sports Council, or Sport UK, Sport England, and all of these are a great way of bringing credibility to sport, because we mentioned that sport, you know, is sometimes not taken seriously unless it's at a very high level. But yet the importance and the importance from a health perspective are so critical to a country. So I think that brings a gravitas and a sense of leadership, although we all know that the majority of sport happens at grassroots level, and the grassroots is critically important to the development of sport. But I think you need to have both as well. And of course, governments then are committed, and they're showing that they care as a country for the well-being, for the wellness, for the sport, for the health and the welfare of the individual. And the same thing actually in Canada. Canada has Sport Canada, who puts a lot of funding into the development of sport and the development of coaches. It's all around opportunities, but it's all around education as well, and ensuring that our coaches are well trained, who provide opportunities for grassroots sport, because coaches are very well trained, providing elite opportunities, but not so much. It's more seen at grassroots level, oh sure, it's just a bit of fun. But surely it's about people at whatever level being the best that they can do. And again, that's what we find through our Special Olympics experience. It's about ensuring that our athletes have the opportunity to grow and develop and be the very best that they can. And that's what we ask of all of us in our lives, to be the best that we can. And sport really offers that opportunity. So therefore, we should ensure that education is a top priority in terms of educating our coaches that work with young children. Again, through the unified sports program that we offer, young people have the opportunity to play with our Special Olympics athletes. And the unique thing about Special Olympics is that all of our athletes are ability grouped. So it's not about the fastest or the greatest. It's about being able to participate at your own level and being the best within that level. So young people that come in without an intellectual disability get to experience that as well. And oftentimes in a regular setting, they don't have the opportunity to do that, and they are often excluded or left out, and therefore get a negative experience. So the whole ethos of Special Olympics in let me win, but if I cannot win, let me be brave in the attempt. You know, we could all, I think, take a lesson from that for society as a whole.
Yeah, it's a very powerful vision. Obviously, Special Olympics have had a lot of success in taking a powerful vision and applying a set of strategies and tactics and pushing it down into the grassroots where it has really taken off. Any lessons learned? Any guidance? Any tactical guidance on as we think about how to scale a culture of health and sports in this country?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, it is important to have a strategy, to have a strategic plan, and we're very fortunate because I just came into the position of CEO very recently. But in accepting that position, I also had a strategic plan that's just been developed. But it was a plan that didn't come from the top. It was a plan that was developed by the grassroots organization, and everybody had an input. We have 170 countries, and every single member had an opportunity to contribute and be part. So it was a very collaborative process, and therefore people had that feeling that they had skin in the game and that they were collaborated with, so therefore they felt an ownership of it. And I think that's important, that everybody feels that they have an ownership. And then I think how you then cascade that right down to the local level, having developed it. But leadership is critically important. I think having the right leadership, great things can happen as a result of that. And we put a lot of effort into building capacity in our leaders. We have established a leadership academy, and we join partners with the corporate community, with ESPN. We've just announced a renewal of our partnership today with them, but with many other corporate organizations as well, like Bain, like Goldman Sachs, like CEB in the leadership field, and they help us to run the academy and to educate our leaders so that they can then understand the importance of building capacities and providing opportunities at a local level. So I would say leadership, having the plan. There are 3 S's in success. One is that you must see, in my view, you must see the big picture, the vision of what you want to achieve. The second S, I would say, stands for that you've got to start it, because oftentimes we all can have great visions but not start anything, or we can have great plans and they sit on the shelf forever. So it's about starting it. And the third S, I would say, is about sticking with it, because you have to then implement, and stick with it until you see the success. And the impact can be phenomenal. And for us, of course, the impact is that we not just transform the lives of Special Olympics athletes, but we also, as I said earlier, transform the lives of the general public in terms of their behavior and their acceptance of differences.
Yep. And I want to get a reaction from other panels, but I have one follow on what you just said there. One thing you've done very well is work effectively with the media. So ESPN televised the Special Olympics this year,
That's right.
Live for a multi-day period for a while. We have seen a lot of storytelling done around your athletes. One of the real challenges in this space is just simply putting a face on the disenfranchised. How have you done it? How have you been able to get the media to tell your stories, and in this case, cover your event?
Well, we have hundreds of millions of wonderful stories from around the world, and it's a matter of packaging those stories and telling them in a way that is exciting and interesting for the media. So, for example, we have one athlete, she's actually a member of our board, Loretta Claiborne, who her mother was told when she was born that she would never come to any good, and just, leave her aside, don't worry. That was 40 years ago. Well, Loretta went on to run 27 marathons. So not many of us can sit and boast that we have run 27 marathons. So when you hear stories of the human endeavor, of breaking down barriers, of overcoming the most incredible obstacles in your life to be the best that you possibly could be, and then go on to participate in Special Olympics and win against yourself. That's very powerful, and it's a great story to tell. And ESPN has done a wonderful job on our behalf in telling that story.
Any lessons? She just shared 3 or 4 of them. About building, taking a movement from the treetops down to the grassroots. Anybody really want to reflect on anything she just said?
I'll jump in on a couple. First of all, on leadership, I think you're absolutely right. And I would just add on, I think we've heard all day today, you've got to have leadership across sectors. None of us can move this individually in a sector. You've got to have the business sector, you've got to have education, you've got to have government, and thinking about how we create an environment, a built environment that enables us to do this. So leadership is critical. Having leadership across sectors and getting them to work together is, I think, a key component of that. And I think your S's are absolutely correct. I would just add measurement to that. Because if we aren't measuring our success and being able to incrementally improve, we aren't going to necessarily get to the North Star that we're trying to achieve. So I would just add those two friendly amendments to
Absolutely, and I totally agree with measurement, as well. It's really important. It's also motivating for people to have some measurement that a goal they can reach to as well.
It's fundamental to sports, right? And
Yes.
it's got to be local and relevant to you.
Absolutely.
And I know we've already said this, but I don't want to miss the opportunity to say it again. It's what gets measured. If you're measuring trophies and numbers and the number of competitive events, it's whether you're measuring those things or the human developmental process. And I think what you're hearing us all say is, and at least for the YMCA, when the YMCA decided to get into sports, when it decided to create things like basketball, it did so because it was leaders were asking, what are we going to do with these guys that have nothing to do? And what can we give them to do that would develop them as human beings? And so they put a peach basket up on one end of a room and they called it basketball. But it wasn't so that they could just play sports for sports' sake. It was so they could play sports so that they could develop as human beings. Those are the measurements we need to be about.
Benita, let me ask you this. I mean, so sport-based youth development is a relatively new term.
Right.
We just talked about measurement. How do we measure success in sport-based youth development?
So, I think there's really two ways that we're trying to do that in New Orleans. One is obviously the impact that the programs and the coalition, and so it's really kind of three parts. We're the backbone organization for a group of organizations in New Orleans, but then we also have secondly built this coalition, and thirdly, we're funded. We have some grant partners, and we've poured about $500,000 into that community, and we've gotten 21,000 kids active. But ultimately, you have to. What was your question? I lost my train of thought.
How do you measure?
So we're measured in
success?
two ways. One is obviously the impact that on the 21,000 kids and the activities and the organizations and the programs that they're doing. How well have those organizations scaled? How much more capacity do they have? But the second thing that we're doing is more of a developmental evaluation around the backbone role itself. And what are the nuances to that? What's success look like in that? So that we are able to now think about going to a different city in Atlanta. We'll be talking more about that probably in the next several weeks. But Mercedes-Benz is one of our key partners. They have the Superdome in New Orleans, and they are building a new Mercedes-Benz stadium in Atlanta. And contiguous with that is the west side of Atlanta, which is one of the poorest, most underserved communities really in the country. And so we want to know, can we take the lessons we've learned, both, as far as the youth-based, sport-based youth development, but also in serving in that backroom role. What have we learned, and what lessons can we apply when we move to another city? And then ultimately, how can we scale that in other communities? If we can't go deep, if we can't pour $500,000 into every community, if we can't physically put employees there and be the backbone organization, but can we apply those lessons and teach other communities to be able to band together in a similar way and have similar results? And I would say, back to the measurement and piece of it, that having a common theory of change, having a common set of goals that you're all trying to reach, and how do you communicate around that? And then how do you, what is that system of collaboration? And that's kind of part of evaluating that backbone role is, what are we doing? How are we interacting with each other? Organizations that would normally be in competition with one another, for participants, for money, for visibility, for staff, for all kinds of things. How do we get them to work together and see that there's a win-win, that the group of them can ultimately achieve far more than they could independently?
I think that's a really important point. And you asked me about some of the countries around the world, but in many European countries, through the sports councils, they would have local sports partnerships. And I think that is a great initiative at local level, because you get all of the various sports and the partners in a very inclusive way to come together and to plan the sport in their community. And then you don't get those clashes, because that's often what's happened. There's even clashes on a Saturday morning between one sport and another sport, and they're vying for young people to join their sport. Whereas if people come together and do it in a collaborative way, then you cut out all of that. So I think that's one piece of advice, certainly coming from some countries in Europe and the way they do their business in relation to the organisation of sport at grassroots level, and other partnerships as well. I mean, for instance, we would partner with national governing bodies of sport so that they can deliver then on the coaching side, on the officiating side. So really they can do the job for us because we don't have the capacity to do it ourselves.
Right.
So building partners is an important part of the development of sport.
Well, one advantage you have, Jorge, is unlike Laureus, which you're a foundation, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is, it's a building in New Jersey with a lot of grant making. You have actual facilities. You are in 2,700 different communities. You got places. So how do you look at? I mean, how can the why be useful in taking a vision of access to sport down to the community level? Given that you have these. Not just places, but credibility and networks, and you've been in these communities for a while.
Well, the YMCA over the last several years, in part because of the help of organizations like the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, has begun to understand itself as not just a place where people come, a place where kids come and play, but also a member of a greater community. And that it sees itself as needing to be involved in the conversation at whatever level that community needs it to be. Yes, we have 2,700 locations, but we actually have some 950 individual independent nonprofits, which is a whole other discussion on how to help that many individuals. But what that also means that it's every YMCA adjusts and reacts to the needs of that community. Sometimes they serve as backbone organizations. Sometimes they just simply provide services. So what we're hoping will happen, much like we've done in some of these other arenas like diabetes prevention, but that we begin to look at sports, youth sports or youth development, and that we begin to play this role of shaping the conversation so that it is not just simply about kids being active, and that's a great and important thing, but that it is about kids being active for a purpose so that they are stronger social, emotionally, cognitively, and physically. And so we've entered in some pretty great conversations in cities all over the country where these conversations are taking place. And the difficulty is translating all of this research and all of these ideas down to that 17-year-old who will coach the team, or the coach who wants to volunteer and relive his glory days, and synthesize all this stuff. And we are really landing on this idea of 3 words: achievement, belonging, and relationship. 3 things we want to make sure that every kid experiences, that they're learning something new every single day they're coming in our work, in our space, that they get a sense of belonging to be part of something greater than themselves, and that they build very healthy relationships with others. And if you think sports naturally does that, when we researched all of our programs, it scored the lowest in those areas.
Yeah.
Because what we learned is that if you're not intentional, then it doesn't intentionally happen, even if the program itself is designed to do those things.
You can't just roll out the ball and expect good things to. It's like a neutral institution, right? I mean, it's all what you do with it. Yeah.
It's like what Billie Jean was saying. It wasn't about having the racket in the court. It was having the right coach to get her started.
Yep.
Yeah, definitely. Jim?
One thing that the American College of Sports Medicine and others have been doing within the National Academy of Sciences and Institute of Medicine is really looking at what are these opportunities within communities, these assets. Certainly the Ys are are one, but there are myriad kind of organizations, and schools for one is a great pivot. I mean, there are so many opportunities available to us to use sports and physical activity to really make progress in very intentional ways. The whole question is not, gosh, what are we going to do? How are we going to find these assets? They're there. The point really is trying to find the model. That what really is the hub that brings them together, that integrates them? By what guidelines should they function? So what I'm impressed with this country and arguably around the world is that communities have so many assets that with just a little bit of modification can become powerful platforms for improvement of health, but all these other benefits that we're talking about. I look at that. But the one thing that we're looking in the initiative that I was talking about within the Institute of Medicine is just how do these assets interrelate to each other? What's the model what's the catalyst that starts bringing them together? And of course, part of that is certainly embedded in Project Play. That's what kind of the overall model, the blueprint of that is. But we are a rich country and quite frankly a rich planet in regard to the assets that can be activated to make the progress that we're talking about.
Can this be done without a national policy on sports like Canada has, like the UK has, like Australia has, like pretty much everywhere has a policy on sport? And it's something, the work group that you chaired called for, the creation of a national policy on sport that, quote, that emphasizes the importance of sports as a vehicle for promoting and sustaining a physically active population.
Yeah, it's one of those things that we as a group came up with that, and then the question is, what is that exactly a national policy? Is that something legislated? Is that something that is coming out of the private sector that becomes the model? I think that there are a lot of initiatives there. I do think that a national policy that does reflect the little d democratization in this country, the decentralization of things. You're not overly prescriptive about things, but a national policy that set directions, that gave guidance as to what to do, that empowered local organizations to be even more successful in their efforts. That kind of national policy, I think, could be powerful. Just lastly on this past weekend, I was speaking with a former member of Congress who played a remarkable role, heroic role in youth sports, and posed that question, what would a national policy look like? And I think we began that conversation, we didn't end it, but the point of, as Project Play does, as the National Physical Activity Plan does, and so many things coming together, it's really identifying not gaps, but really opportunities. We just need to determine what is the best approach to that works well within this country and that really does accelerate and elevate our progress.
Mary, have you seen, how has the policy been useful, if at all, in some of the countries you work in?
I think it has been useful in providing leadership and also giving, as I said earlier, that gravitas, that credibility to sport at grassroots level so that it's taken serious. And when there's a commitment there from the leaders of the country, from government, you find that people do listen because, as I said, sport, apart from elite sport, sometimes is not taken so serious. Like I remember when I went to college and I came from a local community, I had really got good grades in school and I was going to study physical education, and I remember my mother's friends saying, what on earth is she doing that for? She's going to, with those grades, and she's going off to study sport, as if like that was a crazy thing for me to do. I should be doing something else. So it's just not seeing the relevance or the importance and the health benefits of, and the huge saving that it is for governments, when you do provide a quality physical activity program that's all encompassing in relation to the health and well-being and the fitness of the nation.
All right, so you have a policy in place, say it ends up getting developed. I mean, who actually ends up enforcing it, and who I don't know. I mean, in the U.S., the closest thing we have to a sports ministry is the U.S. Olympic Committee, which in 1978 Congress put in charge of coordinating amateur sports activity, unfunded mandate, and it hasn't been the highest priority of the U.S. Olympic Committee. You know, Benita, you were one of the top officials there, you know, until leaving for Laureus. What do you see the role of the USOC being as we move forward?
So, I mean, I see one definite parallel between Laureus Sport for Good and the USOC is that, you know, Laureus has the Laureus Academy, which, you know, is 50 plus iconic athletes and 150 ambassadors around the world. And the USOC, the IOC, both have, you know, huge numbers of inspirational athletes that people can look for. So I really do see, you know, we've been talking about sport as a tool for social change, sport-based youth development. I don't want to overlook the impact that elite athletes have too on this landscape and inspiring people, giving somebody, you know, people something to aspire to, something to look forward to. And for kids, young kids, sometimes that is the motivation for them to get up in the morning and go, you know, get the ball in their hand and or lace up some track shoes. And so I think that's huge. I think another role that they can play is building these alliances. I think that they don't have to do it themselves. They've got you know, a budget that they have decided is going towards the development of elite athletes. But they've got two issues. One is what the First Lady was talking about, and that's fans. You know, where are you going to get more fans of Olympic sport if they aren't participating in the, you know, 40 plus Olympic sports that we have? And secondly, it's pipeline. You know, how are we going to continue to put more and more athletes on the podium if we don't have them filling the pipeline? If they're not healthy enough to join the armed services, they're certainly not healthy enough to participate in the Olympic Games. And so they've got certainly two huge opportunities in front of them in order to really engage in this. One of the areas that I had talked to, Scott Blackman is the CEO, is my former boss, and I talked to him about building these alliances and also maybe putting a challenge out to schools across the country to say, you know, put PE back in the schools, put physical education and recess back in the schools, get kids active again, have school systems pledge, schools pledge to do that. I think that the simple action like that, where schools again say, you know, this is the must-have. This is something that's this is physical education. Its part is as important as anything else to the health and well-being of our students and their achievement in the classroom. And so those are ways that I think that the USOC could certainly do it without a huge heavy lift and still be able to focus on getting athletes on the podium at the Olympic and Paralympic Games.
Jim?
I think one of the shifts, because that's what we're about, pivoting things and nudging progress along. When the First Lady spoke today, she talked about funding, support for these things that we're imagining as an investment, not a cost, an investment. And I think it would really be a net investment. In other words, it is an investment that yields more benefit, more gains than anything that it ever takes in regard to putting money into it. Because just from what we're talking about, just on the health, sports, physical literacy, these kind of elements, everything is there in regard to showing how that would be a net savings for this country. We are never going to be able to outspend the rate in which people are getting sick based on poor lifestyle. And so that's one thing, and then you start factoring in cognitive function and academic achievement and the benefits of individual development and community enhancement. It's the greatest bargain, arguably, that there could be. So in regard to national policy, again, I think the First Lady framed it well, that it's an investment that yields net benefit, and the real point is trying to get us to where we all collectively recognize that and then budget accordingly.
Laureus is a global organization, and they've done studies in the UK that show for every pound they put into sport-based youth development programs, they've saved 5 pounds on the other side of it. So it's almost, it's not even a wash. It's actually, you save money. Absolutely. And obviously have greater benefit.
Yeah, we've done same research in Canada found for every $5 saved. Yeah.
Interesting. Risa?
So I was just going to say, we talk about policy, and that always seems so overwhelming and hard to do. But there's an urgency here. We need to make policy, but we also got to save this generation of kids that are out there right now. And we can do that by looking at the trusted organizations in every community. The Y is the trusted organization in some communities. You have 2,700, you don't have every community. I guarantee you there's a trusted organization that can start to build these infrastructures within their community. And we've got to start that today. We can't wait.
Yeah, I mean, the First Lady really made a call for corporate America to step up and address the problem. I mean, what do you see? Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has made a big bet on physical activity moving forward. How do you see RWJ's role in this space and catalyzing some of these actions that people have prioritized?
Yeah. Well, you use the word catalyze. I think that there is no one way that we're going to do this as a nation. We believe that we've got to measure what's happening in communities all around the country, and so we measure health in every single county. And then we've got to try to do our part to bring people together, those leaders across sectors, give them tools and the opportunity to measure progress. And then connect the places that are doing similar actions so that they can learn from each other. It's sort of the way we've changed things in this country all along. It's by doing it at a local level and then having that roll up to a large policy.
How much time do we have left? I want to cut into Q&A time. Does anybody know?
0.
This is
We've
flashing
got
zero.
Out?
Tom?
Is that a wrap up?
So we can adjust that.
That's us, please. Oh, I'm so sorry. Robbed you of your time.
You got wrapped up.
But it was a great conversation. So some of these folks will be around for the reception. You can ask your questions to them at that time. So I want to thank everyone. Terrific panel, guys. Great conversation. Let's keep it going.